welcome everybody to the first Intuity Tech Talk of 2013. These sessions are especially created for you, our Intuity and BMC Intuity Network Management users, and we do hope you're finding them useful. Now don't forget that all the Tech Talks are available via video on the Intuity website, on the resources page, for your reference. Each Tech Talk also includes any supporting documentation that was generated. So getting back to today's session, we're talking about high availability, how it can be achieved through Intuitive's various deployment configuration. I'm John Diamond, Intuity Product Manager, and also with me today is my colleague Larry Bailon, who's a field system engineer, and we will be your host for the next 20 or 30 minutes or so. It will be your chance to ask us questions on today's topic, which again is high availability. For today's Tech Talk session, all discussions will be based on our newly released product, Intuity 13, which is also known as ENMA 10. If you have any questions on what you're currently running, please don't hesitate to ask after the meeting or just send us an email. Feel free to ask questions at any time via the chat panel on WebEx. So with our platform defined for the Intuity 13, let's begin. Right. I'm going to kick off by just taking you through a couple of topics which are going to be useful in the context of the rest of the discussion today. And the first one is the general subject of multi-user support, multi-server support within Intuity. What I've got in front of me at the moment is a standard single server deployment. I've logged in as the administrator, the admin user, and I've got 4 visible views. If I were to select the My Network view, it's going to show me everything which is under management on this server. Now, this server is called JDiamond PC, and everything that's under management here, you will see listed as belonging to the JDiamond PC server. However, with Intuitive's multi-server support, it's possible for me to connect this server to one or more additional servers. And under that circumstance, having logged into this server, I'm going to be considering it as a central server. And that's also, we have another term called consolidation server. And that's where we consolidate the user interface. We're not pulling raw data back from all of the remote servers and holding them in one central big database. That's exactly what we're not doing. We're working on a federated basis, where the data is left on the databases associated with the servers that do the polling, and as and when it is needed, it is brought into the user interfaces and the reports. So, as I say, I've got one server here. What I've also got is another server called Demo 13, and that's running independently. It's got a bunch of other views here, one of which is called Burbank Office. Let's go back to this first server, and under administration, I'm going to go through the multi-server administration to where we administer the remote servers. Now, my own server is treated as a remote server to myself. That's the bare minimum configuration. What I can do is add in another server. So let's add in this one called Demo 13. And I'm going to log in as the administrator to set up this peer relationship between my central server and the remote server. I'll give the credentials of the remote server and submit that. You'll notice that it's now added to the remote server list. So I've got 2 servers acting as remote servers to my central server, one of which is that central server itself. So let's go back and take a look. Now you'll probably notice here, nothing has changed. And that's just simply because the user interface hasn't updated. I'm going to update it manually, sitting at F5 on the browser. And you'll see now that we've got a mixture of views. This one here, which is actually an access control list, you can see that indicated by the padlock, that's located on the central server, that JDiamond PC server. But you've got that Burbank Office view which is located on the other server, the Demo 13 server. Now let me just take a look at this central view, My Network. That's a special view that always shows me everything that I'm entitled to have access to. Now, as the admin user, as I had an account on both servers, this means it's going to be the composite of all of the devices under management on both of those servers. Now you'll notice here that all of these devices are under management on my local server, but if I scroll down, you'll see that some of these other ones are being managed on the remote server, the Demo 13. Now, as a user, I can continue operating here as though all of these devices are being managed on the same virtual server. That's the way our multi-server support works. Adding more and more more and more remote servers connected to a central consolidation or central server means that they will all act as though they're being managed on the same server as far as the user is concerned. It's the simple way, very straightforward way that we allow you to scale your deployment without having to reinvent it every time you need to go on to another server. Now, that's the important aspect of how the multi-server operation works. One quick point here that I want to emphasize, but it does come in relevant later. I'm going to create a brand new view. I'm on the central server, but I've got that remote server already configured in. I'm going to create it, and I'm going to call it JD. And here you'll see that a view has been created. If we were to go over and log directly into that other server, you won't see that change. But again, as before, I'm just going to update the views, hitting F5, and you'll see that that JD view has been created here on the remote server because it was a remote partner of the central server. So that's an important thing to note. Where you've got this multi-server configuration, views, as they are created, be at the top, when you create a sub-view, that will be propagated out onto the participating remote servers as well to keep all in synchronism. On to another topic that's going to be relevant when you deploy multiple servers. Every server has to be licensed. And in a straightforward configuration, take a single server environment, then Intuity will issue a license file that will allocate a certain number of devices, object licenses, and that will be placed onto that server, and you'll be able to see the content of it through administration, Intuity Health, License Health. That gives you the specification of the license that you are operating on. However, when you've got a lot of remote servers all deployed, that can become somewhat tedious to maintain all those individual license files, particularly if you want to start moving license credits around so that you increase the license capability of one server, possibly at the expense of another. Under those circumstances, if you deploy individual license files, then whenever you make a change, it involves taking the server down, making the license file change, and bringing it back up again. That will involve a maintenance window. What we have is a facility called the Central License Manager, which means you can have a special license cut that will be installed on a central server, and then you have an identical, you have a separate license allocated to the remote servers, and all of those license files are identical. It is not bound to the hardware of the remote server, but it's all administered from the central server. I'll put an example of that. This particular server here, called Fishtail, is acting as a central server. We've got another server called Fisheye acting as a remote server. We've got one of these special central licenses installed, and you can see that when you go to the remote iServers menu, that you've got not only a list of the participating remote servers, but you've also got indication of the total amount of licenses allocated, how much is unallocated, and how much has been allocated to each of the servers. Not only that, but you can also select the remote server, go into the license screen and adjust the number of licenses allocated, and that can be performed without the need for maintenance window. Those can be changed. You can either reclaim or further allocate licenses if you have enough out to those servers, and there will be no break or interruption in monitoring. So that's an important aspect of handling a multi-service deployment. It makes it easier to administer. And that point, which I did mention, but let me reiterate, when you use central license server management, the licenses are no longer bound to the hardware configuration of each of those remote servers. That's an important point that Larry's going to touch on again in just a moment. So at this point, I'm going to pass control over to Larry, and he'll take you through some aspects of further deployment configurations, and particularly how they will impact the use of the high availability type configuration. So Larry, it's all yours.
Thank you very much, JD. So I'm going to cover a few topics. So the rest of this, JD's done the fun part of the presentation, which is all the hands-on. So we'll go over some of the different operating configurations for deploying our software. The first is single server operation, and so there are basically, if you've gone through when our software is installed, basically what you have to do is you have to go through a configuration utility to configure the server for the type of operation that you want. So if you've all got, if you're familiar with that, it's done through a GUI-based mechanism for Windows deployment, and for Linux and Solaris, it's done via the command line. So one of the things that's done during the configuration process is that you select what type of a server that you want to configure. There are actually three types of servers. I'll cover the third one in a subsequent slide. But for single server operation, you have one of two ways that you can configure the server. One is a standard server, which I'm showing here in this diagram. That server would perform our standard network device monitoring, which the primary mechanism is SNMP polling. And that's for devices, for networks of less than 600 devices or 50,000 objects. And definition of an object, as far as our software licensing goes, one device with a managed IP address consumes one object. Every virtual and physical port on the device consumes an object, and every VLAN consumes an object. The second configuration for single server or multi-server operation is what we call an all-in-one server. This capability, when you configure the server for all-in-one operation, this adds the capability of the integrated flow analyzer. So for an all-in-one server, you can monitor devices via SNMP polling and also accept flow records from attached network devices. And we are multi-vendor, compatible with Flow. We accept NetFlow, V5, 7, and 9 from Cisco devices, JFlow, IPFix, and I believe, JD, correct me if I'm wrong, NetStream is one as well. But all that needs to be done for us to process flow records is to point the flow records to the IP address of the server that is configured to collect flow information. The next type of operation is multi-server operation, and this is in environments that are larger than can be performed monitoring on a single server. Well, this is just showing a smaller deployment, and in this case, the typical large deployment utilizes multiple servers. Each server runs the same Intuity software distribution, so there's no difference in the software streams or our software distributions, whether the server is a consolidation server or a central server or a remote server. The designation of the roles is done through the web UI, and typically in a large network environment, a consolidation server does no polling. And it's the point where all users log in. It can be configured for polling, and it's not restricted to being a non-polling server only. But in larger network environments where there are a lot of users and a lot of activity monitoring the network, typically it is a non-polling server. The other servers are designated as remote servers, and a remote server can reside in the same data center as the consolidation server, or it can be geographically remote from the consolidation server. And The placement of the remote servers is dependent upon each specific operating environment of our customers. So in some cases, they'll only be in the data center. In other cases, they'll be both in the data center and geographically remote. And when the server is geographically remote, that means that server is polling local devices, and none of that polling traffic is being sent over the wide area network that connects it to the consolidation server. And then the other operations that can be configured when you're configuring an Intuity server is a dedicated flow collector. So in this case, one or more of your servers or virtual machines are configured to just act as a flow collector, collecting flow records from monitored network devices. The flow collector can be local or remote. In cases where you have a large regional location where you're collecting a lot of flow data, it would make sense to place a dedicated flow collector at that remote site so that the flow records aren't consuming bandwidth over the LAN circuit. And the only other caveat I'd like to mention here is this last bullet point. The network devices that are exporting flows must be managed via SNMP by an Intuity server. So in this case, this architectural diagram that I'm showing out here, the all-in-one server would be also monitoring those devices via SNMP, and the dedicated flow collector is only doing collecting flow information. The next slides will focus on high availability. The one technology that we're going to talk about today is specific to VMware, which is called vMotion. And in the case of most of our customers' deployments, what you're going to see is they're deployed in a cluster where there are N servers, physical servers in the cluster, and each physical server will run M, or a certain number of virtual machines. For the purposes of our slide presentation today, I've magnified the virtual machines that are running on one physical server. There are only 3 yet, but in a typical production environment, that's not going to be the case. There'll be many more virtual machines running on a physical server. And in this case, what I'm showing is all 3 of these virtual machines on this one specific server, including the Intuity application. The next slide is going to basically display what happens with a vMotion switch. And typically what customers do is they will engineer in spare capacity for each physical, for the cluster itself, so that if any one physical server has to be brought offline for any reason, be that a failure, which, as we know, hardware failures are rare these days, or more appropriately, if there's a scheduled maintenance window where maintenance has to be done on the underlying physical server, you can vMotion switch the virtual machines off of that server, and the server will be offline, but the remaining capacity of the servers can handle the load. So in the event of a failure, I'm showing this one physical machine either failing or being brought offline purposely by an administrator. In this case, what I'm showing here is that during the switch, the 3 virtual machines that were running on that one physical server, underlying server, are all transferred to 3 separate physical machines. In a production application, there is no disruption in service, and all the applications are transferred automatically to other physical servers with available capacity. If you're running in an environment with, in a multi-server environment, it's best to also deploy the licensing using the central licensing mechanism, because that takes away the need for us to look at the underlying virtual or physical hardware. If you're running in a single server deployment where you're managing 600 devices or less, you will have to get a license from Intuity that ties the software to an underlying IP address, and that's because in a cluster, the underlying physical hardware does not have to be identical, but has to be similar. So, but for multi-server environments, it's best to deploy the centralized licensing mechanism. Another method that customers use to protect their production deployments and again, I'll talk about the consolidation server first, and then we'll talk about how we can protect that consolidation server. In this case, what I'm showing is a deployment with one consolidation server and 3 polling servers that are in a centralized data center. And again, all clients are logging into the consolidation server. If I want to protect that, I would install a second consolidation server, and then I would front-end both of those consolidation servers with a load balancer. Therefore, in the event of a failure of any one of either of the consolidation servers, the load balancer would take care of ensuring that the users are still can log in and monitor network devices. And during the configuration process, when you set up the multi-server configuration, in this case for vhost 1, the secondary consolidation server, vhost 2, should be made a remote server from that to ensure that the views are consistent across the implementation. The other thing to be made aware of in this particular configuration, where we're front-ending 2 consolidation servers with a load balancer, is that any reports that are created on one of the consolidation servers will have to be replicated on the other. If they're not, then when there's a switch, when one of those goes offline, then the reports that have been previously configured won't be available. And with that, I'm going to pass the ball back to JD, and we'll take any questions that you may have from today's presentation.
Okay, Pat, did you see any incoming questions?
Yes, there was one. I'm not sure if it was completely answered or not. What if we have 2 central servers?
Right. Let me just go over some of the points that Larry raised and make sure that they're all clear. First of all, the central or consolidation server, you can have more than one. And when it comes to a simple multi-server deployment, where you have one central server and multiple remote servers, that's just one way of configuring our multi-server support. In reality, an administrator can set up whatever peering he or she would like between any of those servers. So you could have one remote server peered to another one, which means that you could log into a remote server, treat it as a central server, and then have visibility into one or more, but maybe not all, of your other remote servers. So you've got a lot of flexibility. You can go from what's effectively a hub and spoke type arrangement out to a full mesh and anything in between. Now, what you've also got is, because you've got total flexibility as to who peers with who in terms of the servers, you can put in another server, call it a secondary central or consolidation server, and set up whatever peering you want there. So it can have peers set up to all of the remote servers as well. Nothing stopping you doing that, and that's how you would implement what Larry has been describing. And then another important point there was that if in the first consolidation server, you not only set up peers to all of the remote servers, but you also set up a peer relationship to the secondary consolidation server, and do the similar operation to the secondary consolidation server, where you have the first one acting as a peer, rather like the remote servers. It means that any views that are created or administered when you're logged into either of those consolidation servers will be mimicked on the other one. That way you can keep the view configuration consistent between them. So the overriding answer is yes, absolutely. You can have as many central servers as you want. What constitutes a remote server and what constitutes a central server is really down to how you configure them. And what is a central server in one user's vision, because that's what they're logged into, could be considered a remote server in someone else's view, because they've logged into another server that had a peer relationship with it. And so you've got a lot of flexibility there in how you deploy. Pat, do we have anything else?
Yep. Does vMotion HA work the same with license server?
Basically, The license server, when you're dealing with a central server deployment, the license which is allocated to that central server, which is your total pool of licenses, that license needs to tie that particular server instance onto the virtual physical hardware. Now, ideally, a central server, a central license server, ought to be allocated to a physical operating system, as well, a physical system rather than a virtualized one. However, if you do have restrictions that mean that you have to deploy on a virtual server instance, then we can arrange for a physical license to be cut for that. Under those circumstances as well, that would also support moving that central license server from one virtual host to another under the control of vMotion and audit high availability type facilities.
I think that's all I had from here.
Great. Well, thanks again for everyone taking the time to attend today's session. We're going to send you a summary of today's tech talk in a video format so that you can reference it in the future and share it with your colleagues. If you have any further questions or have suggestions for future tech talks, please don't hesitate to contact us at tech.talks@intuity.com. That is all for now, and we look forward to talking to you again.
JD, we got one more question in if you want to quickly answer it. Is there a limit of how many polling servers you can have on a consolidation server?
There's no predefined limit. The architecture there doesn't have any artificial restriction on that. So we've had folks go up to somewhere around sort of about 20 to 1. That's probably a realistic notional limit, but technically it doesn't stop you beyond that.
And then one last question. Where can someone find more information about the vMotion switch?
Okay, well, vMotion is a standard and a very important capability of VMware's virtual environment. It's not unique to use within Intuity. I would recommend contacting a VMware reseller or going up on the VMware website where you'll be able to get far more detail about that very important aspect of their business.
And I think that's it.
Thanks all. Bye now.